Have you ever built something so precise, so deeply integrated into the way things function, that removing you from the equation would make the whole system collapse, but no one realized it until it was too late? My name is David Tran. I'm 54 years old, and 2 months ago, I stood across from a man half my age while he quietly ended my career. No raised voice, no dramatic showdown, just a line delivered with the smooth polish of a leadership workshop. David, we're moving in a different direction, one that values adaptability and, well, a more modern perspective. Zach Ellison, Director of Systems Innovation, 32, lean, sharp suit, fresh from a tech accelerator with a slide deck full of buzzwords and a confidence only youth and a venture capital pitch can buy. Had spent over 2 decades building the core logic behind our autonomous drone program, code that responded to wind shifts, terrain, and unpredictable environments like instinct. But none of that mattered now. I wasn't fired because I failed. I was fired because I knew too much, because the system worked too well with me in it. They called it progress. I called it the beginning of their slow, silent unraveling. It's strange how quickly people forget what the foundation is made of, when the floors above it start getting fancy. When I joined Aerovolt Systems in 2003, we weren't even building drones yet. We were a ragtag team designing flight stability modules for agricultural robotics, clunky machines that couldn't stay level in a strong breeze. Back then, I was the guy who asked too many questions. Why are we processing GPS updates at 10-second intervals? What happens when we lose satellite lock over a forest canopy? How do we fuse accelerometer noise into reliable pitch correction? Those questions built what would eventually become the company's most profitable product, a proprietary, multi-environment autonomous drone platform used in everything from surveying disaster zones to delivering emergency medical supplies. The system didn't just fly, it adapted. It read shifting barometric pressures like a sailor reads the sea. It could predict micro-turbulence and course correct before a human pilot would even notice the drift. I had written most of the sensor fusion logic in my garage at night, sometimes with a blanket thrown over my shoulders, hunched over 2 monitors, with a cup of instant coffee gone cold by sunrise. I didn't do it for money. I did it because it was a challenge no one else wanted to touch. And because after my wife Lynn passed away in 2017, this was the only place I could still lose myself. She was a science teacher. She used to say I explained algorithms better than I explained how my day went. She wasn't wrong. After she died, I buried myself in the work. I built simulation environments that ran thousands of weather scenarios per hour. I redesigned the firmware to self-tune motor thrust on the fly, based on payload variance. I trained junior engineers, fresh out of school, who now lead teams of their own. Every calibration protocol in that lab had my fingerprints on it. Every thermal curve, every compensation coefficient, every safety override. We hadn't had a catastrophic failure in over 9 years. I knew the systems better than I knew my own home, which is why Zach's words had hit like a switchblade between the ribs. Outdated approaches, rigid thinking, not compatible with our long-term innovation goals. I wasn't surprised, not really. Over the past year, I'd watched the slow tide shift, the way meetings had more consultants than engineers, the way discussions about reducing latency always meant cutting corners, not optimizing performance. Zach's arrival just accelerated the process. He wasn't interested in understanding what we had built. He was interested in replacing it, and me. Still, part of me had hoped maybe, that the work would speak for itself, that the sheer complexity of the system would command a little respect. But I was wrong. Respect is easy to discard when you think you can download genius from a GitHub repo. When the meeting ended, I walked out of the glass conference room with my chin high but my stomach hollow. I wasn't escorted. That came later. I was told HR would be in touch. I walked past the testing bays where 3 prototype drones were hovering mid-air in a test cage, holding formation within 2 centimeters of tolerance. A result made possible by a tiny subroutine I'd once debugged at 2:43 a.m. after a near crash during an Arctic field trial. And yet all of it, every breakthrough, every moment of obsessive iteration, was now reduced to a bullet point on a reorg spreadsheet. Legacy role phased out Q3. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something colder. The dull ache of being forgotten in a building I had helped build. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice was already asking, what happens when the system you built begins to fail? Because no one left knows how to keep it alive. 2. Days after the meeting, I received a call from HR. It was short. My termination package was ready, and I would be escorted into the building the following morning to retrieve any essential personal belongings. Not documents, not notebooks. Nothing related to proprietary systems, of course, just my personal effects. They emphasized that several digital transition protocols had already been enacted. My access credentials had been revoked. My workstation would be re-imaged. I knew what that meant. They weren't just pushing me out, they were scrubbing me out. When I arrived at the building, the security team met me in the lobby like I was a visiting vendor. No badge. No familiar faces from my old team. No one from the exec suite bothered to show. Just a contracted guard with a clipboard and a carefully neutral expression. I was allowed 15 minutes. I walked through the lab floor like a ghost. The place was eerily quiet, humming only with the faint whir of test rigs and environmental sensors. I passed workstation A14, where Priya had first struggled with gyroscopic instability, and we spent 3 weekends figuring it out together. She wasn't in that day. Maybe they told her to work remotely. I reached my station and opened the drawers. A ceramic mug with a hairline crack, a framed photo of Lynn and me from the Grand Canyon, and a smooth, oval-shaped river rock my daughter had painted when she was 7. For good luck, she'd said. I kept it under my monitor. That was all I took. The manuals, the thermal coefficient sheets, the real-time diagnostic scripts I'd written by hand and refined over years, they stayed. Because the truth was, most of the important details weren't in those files anyway. They were in me. I had never written down the undocumented conditions, how the barometric sensor on Unit B9 would drift slightly in low pressure unless pre-warmed by at least 90 seconds of soft load, how the environmental control system overcompensated during sudden humidity spikes, how the firmware expected certain timing lags from older GPS modules and would miscalculate alignment if it didn't get them. None of that was in the codebase. None of it was in Confluence. It lived in my habits, in my instinct, in the hundreds of micro-decisions I made without thinking. The kind of knowledge that can't be taught in a handover session or captured in a process doc. As I turned to leave, I passed the calibration rack where 3 test drones rested in idle mode. Their LEDs blinked a calm green. Stable. Waiting. I looked one last time at the flight control servers across the room. Blinking, breathing, almost sentient in their rhythms. And I thought, let's see how long you last without me. I handed my visitor badge to the guard, gave him a polite nod, and walked out into the cold Oregon rain. I wasn't angry, not anymore, but I was curious. Curious how long it would take before the systems I'd nurtured with such precision began to fall apart. Because they would. And when they did, I'd be the only one who knew why. It didn't take long. 12 days after I walked out, the first crack appeared. A brief email from Priya sent late at night. The subject line read, "Strange drift on Falcon 3. Any chance you can take a look?" I stared at it for a while. She wasn't just reaching out. She was reaching back. Back to when things worked. Back to when she could lean on someone who didn't need to Google every answer. I didn't reply. The next morning, another message, this time from someone I barely knew. Marcus, a new hire from the systems optimization team. "David, sorry to bother you, but we're seeing inconsistent flight paths on models 3 and 5. Autopilot seems to be compensating too aggressively. Any idea what might cause this?" Of course I had an idea. But they hadn't wanted ideas, remember? They'd wanted alignment, fresh perspectives, and the removal of legacy dependencies. I clicked Archive. By the end of the second week, I was hearing from 3 different people, each escalating the same issue in different language. Drift, loss of trajectory integrity, power fluctuations on idle. But all of it pointed to the same root problem. The system was no longer compensating correctly for environmental input. Why? Because someone had changed something without understanding what they were touching. Or worse, they hadn't changed enough. They were trying to operate a hand-tuned, precision-built system using assumptions that only worked in theory. There's a difference between writing software that runs and software that runs in the real world. The drift issue was just the beginning. By week 3, a prototype failed an emergency maneuver mid-demo for a government client. The drone corrected late, hit a soft barrier, and clipped a wing. No one was hurt, but it triggered a stop work order from legal. Zach downplayed it, of course. Early-stage instability already being addressed. I could almost hear the forced confidence through the LinkedIn post he wrote about learning through innovation. But inside that lab, I knew the panic was setting in. Then one morning, my phone rang while I was trimming a maple plank for a cabinet I was building in my garage. It was Priya again, her voice tight, almost whispering. David, I know you're not with us anymore, but something's wrong. Really wrong. We've tried reverting to the previous firmware build, but it didn't help. The drones are failing routine auto-stabilization. Nothing in the documentation explains it. I paused. That was the line. The moment I knew the problem wasn't just growing, it was blooming into something bigger. System-wide failure, like a slow leak in the hull of a ship no one realized was sinking. Still, I hesitated, because part of me was tired, not of the work, but of being asked to patch holes that others had created by pushing people like me aside. I'm sorry, Priya, I said finally. I don't work there anymore. You'll have to talk to Zach. A long silence. He told us the documentation covers everything. I almost laughed. The documentation, the official manuals explained how to set tolerances, sure, but not how those tolerances flexed when barometric pressure shifted unexpectedly during a 14-hour hover test. They didn't mention the subtle impact of warehouse HVAC cycling during winter months, or how signal jitter in urban environments could trick the drone into overcorrecting. Those weren't in the documents. They were in me. After I hung up, I didn't go back to the cabinet right away. I just stood there staring at the unfinished joints and thinking how easily everything built with precision can start coming apart once people decide the person behind the process no longer matters. And something told me, this was just the beginning. 3. Days later, the call came. Not from Priya this time, but directly from Zach Ellison. I let it ring twice before answering. I knew he'd been stewing over this. Knew he had probably exhausted every internal resource, chased every consultant who claimed to optimize flight logic using AI, only to find out that none of them could fix what they didn't understand. David, he began, his voice oddly restrained, like a man choosing his words with care. We've encountered some unexpected issues with the Falcon series. System performance has degraded more than anticipated. Unexpected. That word again. A polite disguise for we broke something and can't figure out how to fix it. What kind of issues? I asked flatly, keeping my tone professional. Instability in autonomous mode. We've tried reverting firmware, bringing in vendor engineers, running diagnostics. It's not enough. We need your insight on the original calibration logic. There it was. Your insight. Not your code. Not your documents. You. I'm not on staff anymore, I replied. You made that clear. He paused. I could almost hear the frustration behind his silence. We're open to bringing you back as a consultant. Temporarily, of course, compensation is negotiable. I didn't hesitate. My rate is $250 an hour. Minimum 5-hour blocks. Payment up front. That seemed steep, Zach replied, carefully. I allowed myself a brief smile. That's the going rate for emergency engineering triage. And let's be honest, this is an emergency, isn't it? Another pause. Then a quiet, all right, agreed. He didn't argue further. That told me more than his words ever could. The situation was worse than they'd let on. And no consultant, no AI tool, no outside vendor had been able to stabilize the system. But I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Because this wasn't just about being needed again. It wasn't even about money. This was about seeing for myself what they'd done to the thing I'd spent 2 decades perfecting. About pulling back the curtain on what had broken and how deep the cracks had spread. Because if they were calling me back, it wasn't just because the system was failing. It was because they were out of options, and I had a feeling the real damage hadn't even surfaced yet. I arrived at the facility the next morning with a temporary access badge and a contract number handwritten on a clipboard. The receptionist didn't recognize me. That was fine, I wasn't there for small talk. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The lab, once a hum of synchronized testing routines, sounded empty, off rhythm. A few machines buzzed, but the ER flow was wrong. There was a tension in the air, not just among the people but in the systems themselves, like a song slightly out of key. Priya met me near the diagnostic station. She looked exhausted, eyes rimmed red, jaw tight from clenched teeth. 3 out of 5 prototypes are grounded, she said. Autopathing is erratic. 1 unit nearly clipped a wall during a vertical hold test. We've reverted firmware, rebuilt configs, but it's like something else is in control. That caught my attention. Show me the logs. We moved into the flight control lab where she pulled up the telemetry history. As I scanned the data, something felt off. There were anomalies in the timing behavior, microsecond shifts in throttle stabilization, unexplained delays in sensor polling. Not random, not chaotic. Patterned. Someone had altered the control loops. Who touched this code? I asked. Skybyte Systems, she replied. They were brought in 2 weeks ago by Zach. He said they could optimize power consumption across the board using predictive machine learning. Skybyte. That name itched at the back of my mind. I'd heard it before in a different context, during a security audit for a government subcontractor 3 years earlier. They weren't optimization specialists. They were a drone manufacturer. A competitor. I looked deeper. The system logs showed embedded processes that hadn't been part of my original design. Remote calls being made to external servers. Data packets leaving the system. Encrypted, disguised as telemetry uploads for performance analytics. Priya, does anyone have a copy of the contract with Skybyte? She shook her head. Only Zach. I didn't wait. I marched straight. To Zach's office, he looked surprised to see me. Find anything? Let me see the contract with Skybyte, I said. He blinked. Why? Because your optimization partner has rewritten parts of your firmware and embedded remote monitoring tools in your system, and they're pulling data, proprietary data, offsite. He didn't believe me at first, until I pulled up the source logs, highlighted the IP addresses, and cross-referenced the activity timestamps. That's standard analytics collection, he argued weakly. No, it isn't, I said. Not unless you authorized a full data sharing agreement with a direct competitor. He opened the contract file and turned the monitor toward me. It was worse than I thought. The contract wasn't with Skybyte's consulting arm. It was with their Aerospace Solutions division, the one that sells end-to-end drone platforms. Buried. In the legalese was a clause authorizing Skybyte to collect system performance data for the purpose of performance benchmarking and industry research. Industry research. A polite way of saying, we're going to steal your IP and use it to improve our own products. You got played, I told him. Zach stood frozen, eyes flicking across the page. But they said they could improve our system, make it more scalable. They made it unstable on purpose. They introduced code-level dependencies your team doesn't understand, so when everything starts to fail, they can swoop in and offer a turnkey alternative. They're not optimizing your system. They're replacing it. His face drained. Of color. The realization was finally catching up with him. I kept going. They've destabilized your code base, introduced external hooks into your sensor logic, and now they're collecting every flight pattern, every edge case correction, algorithm, every thermal response profile I ever wrote. Zach looked like a man staring at a hole in the side of his own ship, only now noticing the water rushing in. We need to cut them out. he said quietly. It's not that simple, I replied. Their hooks are deep. If you pull too fast, you risk collapsing the entire system. The calibration logic is already unraveling. You've got days, maybe a week before even your backup units become unreliable. His next words were almost a whisper. Can you fix it? I didn't answer right away. Not because I wasn't sure, but because I finally understood the scale of what had happened. This wasn't just arrogance or inexperience. This was sabotage, systematic, calculated, and executed with the precision of someone who had done it before. I can try, I said. But I was already thinking several steps ahead about what it would take to unwind this and about what kind of fire I'd have to start just to burn the infection out. Because this was no longer about one company. This was about a competitor who had declared war, and they didn't even know I was coming for them. I didn't sleep much that weekend, not because I was overwhelmed, but because my brain wouldn't stop working the problem. The kind of thinking that burns quietly in the background while you sand a piece of wood or stir black coffee without tasting it. Skybyte hadn't just infiltrated a company, they'd infiltrated a system. They'd studied our firmware structure, our telemetry cycles, our fallback protocols. They knew exactly what to break, and just enough of how to make the failure look like internal error. Sabotage disguised as sloppy innovation. I'd seen this pattern once before, years ago, in a smaller case buried under NDAs and settlement agreements. I knew the signs, and I knew the price of silence. By Monday morning, I had a plan. It would take a week minimum to execute cleanly, and that was if no one got in my way. I returned to AeroVolt with a fresh visitor badge, but this time I brought my own tools. I requested full read-only access to all logs, root-level access, to backup firmware images, and physical access to the telemetry servers. Zach hesitated. I didn't. I'm not going to tiptoe around a mess you invited in, I told him. I'll fix this, but I do it my way. He gave me what I asked for, not because he trusted me. He didn't have that luxury anymore. He gave me access because he was desperate. I started by isolating the infected systems. Anything Skybyte had touched, I pulled offline. I loaded archived firmware builds I had kept copies of, versions from before Skybyte's efficiency patches. I began rebuilding the calibration system from scratch, restoring the thermal balancing routines, reintroducing the tiny delays and harmonics I had once optimized through weeks of field testing. Every parameter had to be retuned, manually. But software wasn't my only concern. Skybyte's code had introduced dependencies, hooks that expected remote confirmation to proceed with normal operation, which meant even after cutting the connection, the drones were still looking for instructions that would never come. So I gave them something to find. Using a sideband protocol Skybyte embedded for data validation, I wrote a proxy service, one that intercepted all outbound data calls and returned responses, plausible ones but fake. I didn't just block Skybyte's access. I fed them misinformation, falsified sensor loads, corrupted navigation logs, fabricated wind drift curves. I built a world where our systems looked dysfunctional, but only on their side. I poisoned their well, one packet at a time. At the same time, I began collecting evidence. Every log entry, every unauthorized patch, every access point that traced, back to Skybyte's servers. I screen captured source code diffs. I printed contract excerpts, highlighted the fine print Zach had never read. I assembled a complete chain of sabotage, from infiltration to data exfiltration. And then I made a call. Marcus Wright. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, but I remembered his voice immediately. Former systems engineer turned digital forensics, specialist at a Fortune 500, one of the few people I trusted with something like this. Marcus, I said, I think I've uncovered coordinated IP theft, possibly corporate espionage. You've got logs. I've got a blueprint. He listened. No interruption, no disbelief, just careful, technical questions. He understood immediately. Don't say a word to anyone else, he said. If Skybyte catches wind of this, they'll wipe their servers clean before a subpoena lands. Keep them thinking they're still in control. Already done, I've been feeding them nonsense for 3 days, he chuckled. You always did play chess when the rest of us were stuck on checkers. I smiled, but it faded quickly, because this wasn't a game. If Skybyte had done this to Aerovolt, chances were they'd done it to others, companies without someone like me watching the gate. On Friday afternoon, I handed Zach a flash drive and a folder. Inside was everything: a summary of the firmware sabotage, proof of data siphoning, a list of vulnerabilities Skybyte had exploited, and a recommendation: immediate system isolation and legal escalation. Zach looked at the documents without speaking, for a long time. Then quietly, "What do I do with this?" "You give it to your legal team, and then, when you're ready to admit how bad it is, you call the FBI." He nodded slowly. He wasn't defensive anymore, just hollow. He looked like a man who'd just discovered the floor beneath him was paper thin. I walked out of his office, without another word, but I wasn't done. Because justice in cases like this doesn't come from revenge. It comes from exposure. And I was going to make sure the right people saw everything. It didn't take long. Less than 2 weeks after I handed over the evidence, the story broke. Quietly at first, a short blurb on an industry security blog noting an investigation into irregular software behavior at a mid-sized drone manufacturer. But within days, the storm hit. The FBI's cybercrime division issued a statement. They were conducting a formal inquiry into Skybyte systems, citing credible evidence of industrial espionage, unauthorized data harvesting, and deliberate sabotage of operational firmware across multiple US-based aerospace and robotics firms. Aerovolt was just the beginning. At least 7 other companies had come forward once the investigation opened. Different sectors, different platforms, but the same pattern. Skybyte embedded themselves under the guise of optimization, introduced subtle vulnerabilities, and then harvested critical telemetry and engineering data before the systems collapsed. Zach called me again, this time from a different tone entirely. Not defensive, not even desperate, just quiet. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." He didn't apologize directly, not at first, but I heard it in his voice. The fallout was swift. Aerovolt's board placed Zach on immediate administrative leave. Legal teams scrambled to reassess every external contract signed in the past 18 months. Product development halted. PR released a carefully worded statement about prioritizing system integrity and recommitting to internal innovation, which was corporate speak for "We messed up. We're lucky we caught it." Priya sent me a message too. No subject line. Just a sentence: "You didn't just save the drones, you saved us." That meant more than anything Zach ever said. The company formally rehired me, but not as an employee. As a consultant, independent, on my terms. I signed a 6-month contract to lead the rebuild of the entire flight control architecture, this time with 2 ironclad conditions: full documentation authority and final say over all future vendor integration protocols. They agreed without question. The first week I didn't even touch the drones. I sat with every engineer, every systems analyst, every junior tech, and walked them through why it had happened. Not just what Skybyte did, but how easy it is to mistake efficiency for understanding. I showed them how technical debt isn't always measured in outdated code. It's measured in forgotten wisdom. And slowly the team began to get it. The machines would recover. So would the company. But the lesson would last longer. Skybyte's leadership, meanwhile, wasn't so lucky. Within a month, 3 of their executives were subpoenaed. Federal agents raided their offices in San Diego. Servers were seized. Internal. Emails leaked. Investors fled. They had built their business on intellectual theft, and when the curtain was pulled back, all their polish and pitch decks dissolved into dust. Justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives in the simple, irreversible clarity of being exposed, and in this case that was enough, because now the world knew. Experience isn't optional. It's the difference between innovation and destruction. 3 weeks later, I was back in my garage. The drones were quiet now, resting on foam-padded shelves under soft work lights. In front of me sat a new prototype, Sleek carbon fiber shell, custom thermal shielding, dual-core AI flight stack. Not for Aerovolt. This one was mine. I'd decided to take on select clients, companies that still cared about doing things right the first time. No shortcuts, no buzzwords, just thoughtful engineering tested by time. My grandson Ethan sat beside me, watching as I soldered a new sensor into place. "You made all this?" he asked. I smiled. "Not all at once, just one right decision, after another. The truth is, technology will always change. New tools, new frameworks, new ways of doing old things. But what doesn't change, what shouldn't, is the value of experience, of judgment, of knowing the difference between a clever solution and a reliable one. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Don't confuse speed with progress, or youth with vision. Sometimes the best innovation comes from the people who've already seen what happens when things fall apart. Thanks for sticking with me through this story. What's one lesson you think modern companies forget too easily? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your take. And hey, if this hit home or made you think differently about experience in tech, maybe stick around. We've got more stories coming.